All right, let's talk a little bit about immigration. We actually have not done much about immigration on this show, and I saw a Rasmussen survey that was really interesting about what Americans think about immigration right now, so let's look at some numbers. 78% of likely U.S. voters believe everyone should be required to prove his or her citizenship before being allowed to register to vote. 29% believe laws that require proof of citizenship before allowing voter registration discriminates against such voters, and 61% say laws do not discriminate, up 3 points from this time last year. Okay, so as I said, we have not done a tremendous amount on immigration, so I'm glad that we're talking about this. And this is one of these things that it's always an issue, and we sometimes talk about it a little bit more, and then suddenly we forget about it, and it's hard to figure out which party's for what. The 78%, let's just talk about that.
Yeah.
That seems pretty legit to me, that basically 80% of the country is saying you should at least be able to prove your citizenship to vote. Does that seem like a sort of baseline way to start?
Well, I think it seems like we've been discussing it so much in the media in a fear-based way, but when you really look at the numbers for things like voter fraud, they're so incredibly minuscule. It really isn't a huge problem, but we've kind of now made it this whole immigration issue in a fear-based issue more than an actual election issue. But the reality of the matter is it does, requiring this kind of voter ID, it does and will continue to discriminate against women, against people who are in lower income brackets, against the elderly, and the majority of this is all political because the people that it affects do tend to vote Democrat. So if you look at this, it's happening in red states. It's happening in red states.
So, all right, before I let you jump in, Jimmy, what's the rationale? Because this is what people say all the time about why is it that having IDs would discriminate against women and minorities?
Well, one of the reasons is because it costs money to end up getting those IDs. Whether it's a birth certificate that you have to use, if you have to have a copy of a birth certificate, that costs money, $15, $20. It costs money to get a driver's license. It costs money to get a passport. And it also requires transportation to certain offices in order to get some of these documents. And that can be discriminatory against people who don't have the funds to do that. I understand the idea of being registered to vote. I understand the idea of making sure that voter fraud isn't a problem. But really, if you look at it, it hasn't been a huge problem.
So, okay, so I get all that for sure, but I basically agree with the people that say you should at least have to prove that you're legally in this country to vote. Am I a crazy conservative on this issue?
Always.
Well, I mean, you have to prove your ID that you're 21 to buy beer. So I don't think saying that just proving that you live in this country
buying beer
is too much.
Is not a guaranteed right in the Constitution, right? So that's really the difference there. But I think that once I was informed about the ramifications of a voter ID law, I was against the voter ID law because they know they can scientifically prove that it's going to eliminate a certain percentage of people from voting for all the reasons she just said, right? Because they're poor and they don't have access, right? And people are like, well, I got an ID. Well, some people don't. There's a 90-year-old woman who's been voting her whole life, and she doesn't have transportation, and she doesn't have money, and she lives on a fixed income, and she doesn't have access to get to that stuff, but she can vote. And they'll say, but no, you can't vote now because you can't do these certain things that we're going to change. So there is, again, this is a solution in search of a problem. There is no voter fraud. Nobody's going and voting twice. It's not happening. So the only reason you would want to implement this is to make sure you tilt the favor in favor of the Republicans and you discriminate against some of the Democrat votes. That's the only reason you would do this.
And to that point, it does seem that the Republicans are the ones that want this all to happen, all these voter ID things. So they're not doing it out of the goodness of the country. They're doing it out of the goodness of
They're on tape saying it.
Right, you're thinking Kansas, Arizona, North Carolina.
Yes, it's just like the guy from Pennsylvania. We've seen that clip a bunch of times where the guy said, a voter ID, which is going to guarantee the state of Pennsylvania for Mitt Romney, done. You've seen that clip. That's why they do it. And again, the news media pretending that it's a legitimate argument or not, or what they're doing isn't voter suppression. Why isn't every reporter screaming from the top of their lungs about voter suppression in America? And it's because they're bought and paid for, and they don't want to piss off half the people who want to suppress the vote.
Right. So what would you guys say to Bill O'Reilly, who's on TV every night saying that if if you let these immigrants that are already in the country, the people that are here illegally but they are acting as U.S. citizens, if you let them in, they will all vote Democratic and it will be the end of the Republican Party, which may in a weird way be bad for our political system if we really only became a one political thing, even though we're pretty much a one political thing as is. But what would you say to that argument?
I would say that's just fear mongering. That's just trying to scare people into believing that there's a problem that really just isn't a problem. You know, they're making the discussion about something that isn't a huge issue. There are so many other things that we should be focusing on and talking about, and this is a way to try to maintain control in these very red states.
Yeah, and also 95% of the people that are here, even if they're here illegally, are perfectly legal people within our borders. You know what I mean? They're working jobs and have families. I know people personally who've had families split up and people have been deported that can't see their children for 20 years. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff.
When Bill O'Reilly says, well, we can't let all these immigrants come here because they're going to vote Democrat and it's the end of the Republican Party. Well, what that really means is, hey, there's a bunch of people who we're going to have to appeal to with our policies now that we don't want to have to appeal to with our policies, so we can just keep them away from voting, so we can just keep on appealing to a narrower and narrower base of people. Yep. That's exactly what they're saying. Oh my God, we're going to have to address the reality that what we want in America isn't what most people want in America? Holy shit. Right. Yes, then you should have to change your party's platform or you go away.
Right, and the thing is, in America, we're all children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants. Give us your tired, you're poor, you're hard a mess, and somehow we don't want that anymore.
It's a melting pot.
So final thought on this, because obviously we talk about immigration forever,
yes.
But what do you think about securing the border? Because that does seem like a legitimate argument, to me at least, that first somehow we should be able to secure the border, and then, you know, to stop new immigrants from coming in illegally while we deal with the issue, not that we ever do anything in a correct order. But at least, that argument at least makes some sense to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely an important issue to think about. We have all of the legislation really in place to deal with illegal immigration. We just don't have a lot of real enforcement. We are backwards. We do things kind of in the wrong way. We do approach things in a cart before the horse kind of way when it comes to, and immigration is one of them, when it comes to things like immigration.
Right, because for the last 5 years we could have been dealing with border issues. Just deal with figuring out how do we secure the border, and then say, okay, we've dealt with that. Now we can deal with the people who are here and the people who want to get in. But we never deal with anything in the correct order, do we?
Well, no, of course not. Well, it's because there's this crazy, dual interests, right? So corporations, big farming corporations, big ag business, they want cheap labor, but then they don't want them to be able to vote, so then they can vote into a union, right? So it's that push. They want them here to work, but they don't want to treat them like human beings.
Right. That's my point with the legislation. Like, there are people who are here, and people are willingly paying them under the table and paying them tax-free, and those laws aren't being enforced because there are so many big corporations who are benefiting from that kind of thing. So that it's already there. We've established what's illegal, but we aren't necessarily enforcing it because there's a benefit to it.
Isn't that is you're right, Jimmy, about the irony of the Republicans, because especially the Mexicans that come in, they work at jobs that Americans don't seem to want to work, and they bust their asses for 18 hours a day doing the hardest labor-intensive jobs, and then they don't get much for a return, and that's good for the corporations, and really, we know.
It's the lazy Mexicans coming in here taking our jobs.
Taking our jobs. They want this gig, but I'm keeping it, people.